me start by asking the three of you gentlemen, what is exactly your assessment of this specific summit? Mr. Yuan?
I think generally speaking, it's a very successful summit.
You are using that word, successful.
Yeah, it's successful from Chinese perspective. And even if it's not a very good timing for this early summit, because President Trump is facing lots of trouble domestically and internationally, but the U.S. and China cannot wait for the final resolution of his domestic issues. So the two presidents meet as early as possible. I think is a good idea. Right. I think during this summit, I think first of all the two leaders establish personal friendship and personal relations. Yes, using another American word is a chemistry. Both has a chemistry. This is very important for the future relations between the two leaders and the relations. And secondly, for mechanism, for channels, which is very useful for sustaining the U.S. and China normal track in the future.
I see. Talking about the atmospheric and also chemistry that is being described by Secretary Tillerson from the U.S., it is positive and very fruitful exchange. The Chinese side used very similar words. So, Mr. Walsh, what about your assessment?
I largely agree. I think it's a success. Now, part of that is measured against what we were up against. This could have gone very badly. There are lots of issues in the U.S.-China relationship that are deeply divisive right now. And Mr. Trump had said some really nasty things about China during the election. So relative to how it might have gone, and believe me, if you've seen any of these other summits with Mr. Trump, for example, the one with Germany's Angela Merkel, that was deeply awkward and just plain weird, especially since they're an ally. So I was sort of holding my breath about this one. And I think all things considered, you know, it worked out pretty well. Did they sign a bunch of agreements? No, but you have to learn to walk before you learn to run. So I'm going to score this a success.
Very true. Mr. Orlins on the phone, did you also have a big sigh after the summit wrap up?
Well, yes. I mean, I think there was certainly, I kind of was saying there was a 10% chance that it might really go off the rails, and it didn't. I think the personal chemistry was terrific. The agreement, I think President Trump's acceptance of President Xi's invitation to visit China is terrific. You know, I think kind of the soft stuff, the songs by President Trump's grandchildren in Chinese were terrific. And again, as Jim said, the contrast to Trump's campaign rhetoric was stark, was absolutely stark, that, you know, saying we have this great, incredible relationship was really quite a contrast to what he was saying during the campaign.
Right. Finally, it is going to the other 90%. That is really terrific, in your words, Mr. Orlins. But having said that, though, how much would a state visit, as Mr. Trump, the U.S. president, committed to, eventually would mean for the relationship? Of course, at this time, it's still early. But Mr. Yuan, I do want to ask you about this. What does it mean, usually, a state visit, and one leader of one country agree with the other leader that I will visit your country later in the year? It is going to be a state visit. What is really the weight of it?
I think the state visit, which will be later this year by President Trump, will be more substantial, because this time the summit in Mar-a-Lago is more informal, and the informal is a very good start for establishing the personal relations, establishing some formal mechanism for the sustain the relations to move ahead. But more substantial talks in touching more substantial topics, we're waiting for next state visit by President Trump. So state visit actually will achieve some agreements, some formal documents, which is more necessary and needed for the future relations. So in this regard, I think President Trump agreed to pay state visit to China. I think it's another achievement by this summit, I think.
Okay, so much for the ABCs of diplomacy, I guess. Now let's deal with the real issues. Shortly after the summit between President Xi and Mr. Trump, the Pentagon already announced that the carrier group is heading to the Korean Peninsula to strengthen U.S. military presence. In an early briefing, Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, said the two leaders also agreed on the so-called urgency of the threat of North Korean nuclear programs and agreed to work together to resolve the issue, quote, peacefully. Mr. Orlins, DPRK nuclear program, we have asked many times before whether it will be a divisive issue or it is likely to be an issue that's likely to unite the United States and China. Given the recent incidents and actions and inactions, what do you think?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that while President Xi was having dinner with President Trump, the 59 Tomahawk missiles hit the Syrian air base that was responsible for the launch of the chemical weapons attack in Syria. President Trump could have waited 24 hours. He could have waited 48 hours. He chose to do this while President Xi was there to emphasize America's commitment to resolving issues that are kind of stuck. So I think President Trump's view of North Korea today, it's stuck. We've been stuck in the same rhetoric for years, and while that rhetoric is going on, we're seeing North Korea develop more and more nuclear capability, more and more missile capability. So what he was doing was making a clear statement that if we cannot resolve this through diplomatic means, through increased sanctions, we are willing to take action unilaterally. So that's what was going on, and I think what we hope happens is that U.S. and China interests coincide more, and we're able to put more pressure on North Korea to get back on the right track.
Great to have the American perspective. Now, what about the Chinese perspective? Of course, Minister Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, briefed the media and also talked about the urgency of the DPRK nuclear weapons program. But he is stopping short of using some of the words that the American side has been using. Certainly, China is not necessarily taking military actions, to say the least. So what exactly is going on, Mr. Yuan, from the Chinese perspective?
Actually, U.S. and China has the same goal. That is a denuclearization of North Korean nuclear capability. But we sometimes have different tracks, different means. However, when U.S. and China in a very good mood, we do have some good cooperation. For example, during Bush administration, we have 6-party talks. But however, when U.S. and China face some difficulties in our bilateral relations, the DPRK always use the competition between our two powers to achieve its own goal. So most importantly, this time, I think the summit proved that, first of all, both sides deepening the understanding of each other's stand on this issue. This is very important. And secondly, ensure the same goal in the future, including the peaceful resolution. And finally, we'll find some proper ways to cooperate. However, I think in this regard, I think given the new reality that the deployment of a THAAD system in South Korea made it the sincere cooperation is more difficult. So how to kick off the obstacle, which I mean the THAAD system in the near future, so that we can focus on our real cooperation in the near future, I think is very important.
And of course, Chinese side raised that, according to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, during that specific summit between President Xi and President Trump. Mr. Walsh, having heard what the Chinese perspective is, let me read out just a little bit part of the briefing given by Secretary of State Tillerson after the summit between the two presidents. He's talking about that the United States understand that it might be difficult for China to cooperate on some of the ways that the U.S. might be dealing with the DPRK nuclear issue. In that way, according to him, the U.S. would go its own course. What does that mean? Does it mean literally U.S. would just go its own way without consulting China?
Well, those words sort of echo something that President Trump had said earlier about, to China, either solve this problem or we'll do it for you. I don't think that's very helpful rhetoric. I'm also troubled by the fact that, we have an ally, South Korea. This is not a U.S.-North Korea issue alone for the U.S. to solve by itself. South Korea, which does not have a president, will not have a president until May, is very much a part of this. If there was a war, it would be fought on South Korean soil, not in the United States. So I would really urge the president to sort of tone that rhetoric down and talk more, and wait for the South Koreans to have their election, and then to sit down with the new South Korean president and for them to get on the same page. It's important that the U.S. and China cooperate and find some common interest, but it's also important that the U.S. Be with its ally, South Korea. And that doesn't mean just sending ships. It means including the new president in that policy-making process.
That doesn't mean just sending a ship, but the ships are being sent at this moment. Aircraft carriers going to the area. Mr. Orlins, you heard the one side of the American perspective. What about your side of the American perspective?
Well, I think we need to use carrots and sticks. We're focusing more on the sticks in terms of talking about increasing sanctions, which we should do. We should not give up the sticks. And there's put in place secondary sanctions for companies that continue to do business with North Korea, including Chinese companies. So if the Chinese don't or choose not to cooperate with the U.S. on that, then the U.S. should do it unilaterally. I think that's part of what President Trump and Secretary Tillerson mean. We should also kind of go back to what we tried at the end of the Clinton administration, where Secretary Albright went to North Korea, where we had conversations, where President Clinton came very close to going to North Korea. We should and President Trump has expressed a willingness. Obviously, I don't think you should go to North Korea, but we should start having more contacts with North Korea, give them some upside in cooperation rather than give them some carrots rather than just sticks of sanctions and potential strikes against their capabilities.
Mr. Yuan, my final question for you on this issue is, has China really fundamentally changed its stance about the DPRK and how to deal with DPRK after the summit?
I don't think so. I think our stand is still the same. First of all, the goal is still the same: denuclearization, peace, and stability. Those three pillars of our North Korean DPRK nuclear policy, I think, interlinked, cannot kick out any single one. I think this is the same. And the second, peaceful resolution. And thirdly, through dialogue. So all those major principles and means still there. But maybe the urgency for us to view the North Korean DPRK's nuclear capability is more serious than before, and the urgency for the cooperation is more serious than before.
Certainly there is the urgency. It's not just in the DPRK issue. This is only one of those examples that the two sides have to work together. In fact, both sides have agreed with the kind of mechanism for dialogues. We earlier mentioned in our backgrounder, both its diplomatic and security dialogue, the economic comprehensive dialogue, and also law enforcement, cybersecurity dialogue, as well as the culture and the social dialogue. Among them four, the first two really stand out because they're going to be implemented immediately. And all of these dialogues are presided, Mr. Yuan, by the two presidents. So it is kind of impressive which level this is already going, the mechanism. Talking about economic dialogue, 100 days, is it a deadline or is it a window opportunity?
I think both. I think for Trump,
you can't just sit on the fence, Mr. Yuan.
You know, Trump. I think Trump is very urgent to achieve two things. One is North Korea needs Chinese real cooperation, but so far it's very difficult. And secondly, want trade relations. Resolve the deficit, resolve the American economy growth and employment. Seems all the cards on Chinese hands. It's totally unrealistic in this way. So how to make his promise to the American people more realistic? Then find some compromise way. That is a 100 days plan, which means they will do it with China in 100 days to show that it's more capable to deal with China, because all the other predecessors waste years of timing discussing with China. Only Mr. Trump can make 100 days to achieve the final goal. But still, I think if you think that's a deadline to achieve a selfish American goal, I think is still unrealistic. So how to find a mutual respect, win-win cooperation way, using this 100 days to achieve a win-win result, I think this is something we should respect.
It really takes a lot of wisdom, in fact. And Mr. Orlins, you've been working on China-U.S. relations for decades. I mean, you understand this. The U.S. structural problem is not caused by China. If you don't have the jobs here in China, you're going to ship it somewhere else, to Vietnam or Turkey, some of the other countries. So what is actually likely to be handled by this comprehensive economic dialogue within the next 100 days? What can be on the list which can really benefit the goals from both sides? It has to be on mutual respect, as the two presidents already agree with one another. Mr. Orlins, any inspirations?
I think there are a lot of things that can be done to kind of further the goal without kind of where you can have a win-win cooperation. So you can have tariff and non-tariff barriers that China has reduced. That both benefits the Chinese consumer, benefits reform in China, and creates some jobs in the United States. That's whether it's automotive tariffs or others that are much higher in China than they are in the United States. You can very quickly get an equalization. You can open sectors of the Chinese economy to U.S. investment, to all foreign investment. That's good for the Chinese consumer. It's good for Chinese business. It's good for implementing the third-party plenum reforms. It's a positive for China. You can make progress on the bilateral investment treaty, which would be good for Chinese companies in the United States and good for U.S. companies in China. You can make investments in infrastructure in the United States. There are lots of things which in 100 days both administrations could accomplish. This is not rocket science. The proposals are already out there. You just need the political will to implement them. You're not going to create millions of jobs in the United States, but you are going to create some jobs in the United States and allow President Trump to take credit for it.
Well, but China's job is not to let President Trump to take credit for it. I mean, China's job is to do things that is going to be beneficial for its own country and its own people as well. And the thing is, go ahead, sir.
These changes are good for these changes are good for China.
We heard you, sir.
These changes are good for China.
We heard you, sir. Yeah. But, you know, Mr. Yuan, what about China's priorities? I mean, there are things that China could prioritize for its own sake. There are things the U.S. would also have on the very top of its list. Are those lists going to coincide with one another? I think that is the thing that the two sides need to think about.
Yeah, for China, I think most important thing is how to achieve the so-called moderate prosperous society in a all-around way in 2020, the first 100 years dream goal. This is what President Xi and his team is working towards. I think for this, we need a very good and sound U.S. and China relations. We need sustained Chinese economic growth. I think in this regard, the U.S. and China has lots of space to cooperate. For example, I have noticed that President Xi invites Americans to join One Belt, One Road initiative of China. And I also noticed that President Trump and his team showed interest in thinking about the future possibility to be part of Belt and Road initiative, including AIIB. I think if we think that way, we can achieve lots of things that his predecessors cannot achieve in the past.
Okay, final words, just to be fair for our other panelists. Mr. Walsh, one thing that is very clear, we all function on a bilateral way, but also under the international system. So how will that, in a way, help us and support us go through this 100 days and beyond? Very briefly from you, Mr. Walsh.
Well, I support multilateralism, and I would hope that it can deepen that relationship. But both China and Mr. Trump tend to prefer bilateral arrangements to multilateral arrangements. So it's really going to be about these two big, great powers, whether they can get it together or not. And while these are welcome first steps, a good meeting, a working group, all this stuff is good. Mr. Trump describes himself as a counterpuncher, as someone who follows his instincts. So as we look forward, we have to be honest and say, if there's an incident here or something happens there, things could turn very quickly. So I hope it moves forward, but we have to be realistic here.